The morning Lydia Whitaker walked into the land office in Caldwell, Kansas. She had $47 sewn into the hem of her dress, a deed application filled out in her neatest handwriting, and a determination so fierce it could have stripped paint from the walls of that dusty little building. It was the spring of 1880, and the Oklahoma Territory lands were opening up in ways that made men dream and women pray, and Lydia Whitaker had been doing both for the better part of 2 years. She had risen before dawn that Tuesday morning, while the town of Caldwell was still draped in the gray-blue quiet of early light. She had brushed out her dark hair and pinned it carefully at the nape of her neck, had shaken the red Kansas dust from her one good dress, the dark blue wool that had seen her through her mother's funeral and her arrival in this town, and every hard day since. She had eaten a small breakfast of cornbread and black coffee at the boarding house, where she rented a room the size of a generous closet, and she had walked the 6 blocks to the land office with her chin up and her heart hammering. The office smelled of ink and sawdust and pipe tobacco. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, pushed by no wind at all, as though it were simply going through the motions. Behind the long wooden counter stood a man named Gerald Pratt, who wore spectacles on the end of a thin nose, and had the general disposition of a man who had decided long ago that his day would be ruined and was simply waiting for the event that would accomplish it. He was the land agent for Sumner County, and he had been behind that counter for 11 years. And in those 11 years, he had developed a very particular opinion about who deserved land and who did not. Lydia stepped to the counter and laid her application down with both hands, smoothing it flat the way you might lay out something precious. "Good morning," she said. "I am here to file a homestead claim under the Homestead Act. I have my application completed and I have the $14 filing fee." Gerald Pratt looked at the application. He looked at Lydia. He looked at the application again with the particular squint of a man who has found something offensive in a document. "You married?" he said. "No, sir." "Widowed?" "No, sir. I am an unmarried woman of 24 years, and I am well within my legal rights to file under the Homestead Act as the head of household. Single women are permitted to file, same as men. The law is clear on that point." Gerald Pratt pressed his lips together until they disappeared entirely. "The law may be clear," he said, in a tone that suggested the law was a distant rumor he found only mildly credible, "but practice is another matter. A woman alone cannot prove she intends to cultivate and work 160 acres of land. You would need a male signatory to co-file, or you would need to demonstrate substantial means and equipment." "The law does not require a male signatory," Lydia said, and her voice did not shake, though she wanted badly for it not to. "I have read the Homestead Act of 1862. I have read the amendments. There is no such requirement." "Ma'am," said Gerald Pratt, pushing the application back toward her across the counter, "I am telling you how things work in practice, and in practice, I am not processing a claim from a woman alone who has no husband, no male partner, no documented equipment or livestock, and no cosigner. You come back with a husband or a brother or some substantial proof of means, and we will have a different conversation." Lydia stood very still. The paper sat between them on the counter, and the weight of the morning, of the 2 years of saving, of the weeks of careful planning, of every small hope she had pinned to this day, pressed down on her like a physical thing. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears in places like this only confirmed what men like Gerald Pratt already believed about women like her. "This is not legal," she said quietly. "What you are doing is not legal." "What I am doing is running this office the way it has always been run," said Gerald Pratt, and he turned away, as though the matter were settled. The line behind Lydia had grown while she stood there. 3 men, a father and 2 grown sons by the look of them, standing with their own applications and their own plans, watching with the polite discomfort of people who know they are witnesses to something wrong, but have not yet decided whether to acknowledge it. And behind them, leaning against the doorframe with his hat pushed back on his head and his arms crossed over his chest, stood John Barlow. He was 31 years old and built the way Kansas wind builds things, lean and enduring and shaped by years of work that left no excess on a man. He had dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends from too many days under a hat, and eyes the deep color of river water in late autumn, a gray-green that shifted depending on the light and his mood. He had a 3-day growth of beard and a shirt that had been cleaned this morning, and was already carrying the marks of a long ride. He wore his gun belt easy on his hip the way men do when they have been wearing one so long it has become simply part of their silhouette. He had come to file his own claim. He had been saving for it differently than Lydia had, through 3 years of cattle drives up from Texas, through winters spent breaking horses for ranchers who paid in cash and didn't ask too many questions, through a careful, grinding patience that was the defining quality of John Barlow's character. He had a piece of land picked out, had ridden the section himself, knew every creek bend and rise of it. He had his application in his hand. He had heard every word of the exchange at the counter. John Barlow was not, by nature, an impulsive man. He thought before he spoke and he measured before he acted, and he had a deep distrust of decisions made in heat rather than in clarity. But there were moments, and he had learned this about himself over 31 years, when clarity arrived fast and whole and required no measuring at all. He unfolded his arms and stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said to the father and the 2 sons, who parted without argument because something in John Barlow's manner suggested this was not a negotiable request. He stepped up to the counter beside Lydia. She looked at him with the wary, measuring expression of a woman who has already had one bad surprise this morning and is not particularly in the mood for another. "Sir, this is not your concern," Gerald Pratt said, without looking up from where he was straightening papers that did not need straightening. "I am making it my concern," John said. His voice was mild. This was the thing about John Barlow when he meant something. The quieter he became, the more certain he was. "This woman has a legal right to file a claim. You know it and I know it and she knows it and the law knows it. You are refusing to process her application without legal cause. I told her the requirements." "You invented requirements that do not exist," John said. He placed his own application on the counter next to Lydia's. "She is filing, and if you will not process hers alone, then put her name on mine. File it jointly. I will co-sign. And then I want it noted in your ledger because I will be checking the records at the county seat to make sure my name and hers appear exactly as we filed them." The office had gone very quiet. Gerald Pratt looked at John Barlow for a long moment. He looked at the way John's hand rested on the counter, relaxed but present. He looked at the gun at John's hip, though John had made no move toward it and would not. He looked at the father and the 2 sons standing behind them who were now watching with undisguised interest. "You 2 married?" Pratt asked finally. "We are co-filing," John said. "That is a legal arrangement that requires no marital status." Pratt's jaw worked. "I will need both your signatures on a joint application." "Then bring us a joint application," John said pleasantly. Pratt brought one. Lydia looked at John. She had not spoken since he stepped up, and there was something in her expression that was not gratitude exactly, or not only that, but rather the look of someone recalibrating, trying to understand what has just happened and whether they should feel relieved or resentful or both. She settled for the moment on practical. "I do not know you," she said quietly, under the scratch of Pratt's pen as he prepared the form. "John Barlow," he said, and extended his hand. She took it. Her grip was firm. "Lydia Whitaker, Miss Whitaker." "I will not have you think I needed rescuing," she said, still quiet, still watching him with those steady, serious eyes that were the color of dark honey in the morning light. "I do not think that," John said. "He was breaking the law. I have a particular dislike of that. Most men do not notice when it is being broken against a woman." "I noticed," he said simply. They signed the joint application. Lydia paid her $14. John paid his. Pratt processed the forms with the particular stiffness of a man who has lost an argument he was certain he would win, and he stamped them and recorded them and handed over the receipts without a single additional word. They walked out of the land office into the bright Kansas morning and stood on the boardwalk in the spring sunshine, and Lydia read over her receipt twice and then folded it carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her dress. "Well," she said. "Well," said John. There was a moment of the comfortable, awkward silence of people who have just done something significant together and are not yet sure what it means. "The land is in both our names," Lydia said. "That is a complication I did not intend to create for you this morning." "It is a complication I created willingly," John said. "The land office records will show what they show, but I have no intention of making any claim to land that is yours. We can sort out the legal arrangement separately once you have had time to think it through. And in the meantime, would you like some coffee? I have been on the road since before daylight, and there is a diner 2 doors down that I have been thinking about for the last 4 miles. Lydia looked at him. Then, for the first time that morning, she almost smiled. "I believe I would." The diner was small and warm and smelled of frying bacon and yeast bread, and the woman behind the counter was wide and cheerful and set coffee in front of them without being asked, the way good diners always do. They sat across from each other in a booth near the window, and the morning went on outside while they talked. Lydia told him about herself in the careful, measured way of someone who is accustomed to being judged on the telling. She had grown up in Missouri, on a farm outside Springfield, the second of 4 children. Her father had died when she was 19, and her mother had followed 18 months later, and the farm had gone to debt, and her older brother had gone west and never come back, and her younger siblings had been taken in by relatives, and Lydia had been left to make her own way. She had worked as a seamstress in Springfield for 2 years, then as a cook at a boarding house in Wichita, and she had saved with the particular ferocity of someone who knows that money is the only wall between herself and a very hard wind. She had found a parcel of land listed in a surveyor's report, 160 acres along a creek tributary south of the border, good grass and reliable water, and a hillside that caught the afternoon light in a way that made it look like something from a painting. She had made up her mind to have it. John listened without interrupting, which Lydia noticed, because men who listened without interrupting were rarer than she would have liked. His own story came out more slowly, not from reticence exactly, but from the habit of a man who has spent a great deal of time alone and has gotten out of the practice of narrating himself. He was from Texas originally, from a cattle family outside San Antonio. His parents were both living, which he said with a small, private warmth that Lydia found unexpectedly touching. He had spent his 20s on cattle drives. The long Kishom Trail runs up to Abilene, and then Caldwell when the trail shifted north, and had saved enough to want something of his own. He had a horse named Pilgrim, and a saddle that was 15 years old and a bone-handled knife his grandfather had given him, and those were the things he considered worth mentioning. He did not mention that he had a way of looking at people when they spoke that made them feel that what they were saying was the most interesting thing he had encountered in some time. He did not mention that his laugh, when it came, was quiet and genuine and surprised you, because it was not the laugh you expected from a man built the way he was. He did not mention that he had been watching Lydia Whitaker stand her ground against Gerald Pratt for a full 2 minutes before he stepped forward, and that in those 2 minutes he had thought she was the most remarkable person he had seen in a very long time. They had been talking for an hour when Lydia looked up and realized it. "I have a great deal to do today," she said, a little startled. "I have to find a surveyor who will walk the section with me, and I need to speak with the hardware merchant about the cost of lumber." "I am riding south today to see the land," John said. "The section I filed on is a half-mile northeast of the creek tributary. I would not be opposed to company on the road if you are riding that way." Lydia considered this. It was the kind of offer she had learned to consider carefully, because offers of company on roads were not always what they presented themselves as. But she had spent an hour across a table from John Barlow, and she had a good instinct about people, honed by years of needing to rely on it, and her instinct said this was a man who meant what he said and no more. "I have a horse at the livery," she said. "I will meet you there in an hour." She was there in 45 minutes, because Lydia Whitaker was almost always early. The ride south from Caldwell was the kind of day that Kansas offered in apology for its winters, all wide sky and new grass so green it almost hurt to look at, the air carrying the sweet, wild smell of prairie flowers and turned earth. They rode side by side at an easy pace, and the conversation moved between them without effort, circling from practical matters: how deep a well would need to go, the price of seed corn, the nearest mill, to less practical ones, books they had read and whether they had survived, and what a person did with loneliness when it got particularly heavy. "Do you not find it difficult?" John asked somewhere around the 2nd mile. "Being out here alone." "I find it necessary," Lydia said. "Difficult and necessary are not the same thing. I do not have the option of finding it too difficult." "I meant no offense by the question." "I know you did not." She was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle over the grass ahead of them. "It is sometimes difficult. I will not pretend otherwise. There are evenings when the town feels very loud with other people's lives and very quiet with my own. But the idea of the land, of having a place that is mine and that no one can take from me, that makes the difficult part smaller." John looked at her profile against the prairie sky and thought that he had never heard anyone put that particular feeling into words before, even though he had been carrying it himself for 3 years. They found her section first. They dismounted and walked the east boundary together, and Lydia moved through the tall grass with a sureness that told John she had been here before, had walked this ground and learned its character. She showed him where the creek bent, where the soil darkened with good clay content, where a natural rise in the ground would give her a vantage point that caught every direction of wind. She stopped at the crown of the small hill and stood looking out over the 160 acres of Kansas grass and afternoon light, and her face did something that John suspected she would not have permitted if she had known he was watching. It opened. All the careful guardedness went out of it, and what was underneath was a pure, unguarded joy that transformed her features entirely, made her look younger and more herself and impossibly beautiful. He looked away before she turned around. "This is it," she said, and there was a softness in her voice she had not used all day. "It is fine land," he said, and meant it. They rode to his section next, and he walked it the same way she had walked hers, with knowledge and care, showing her where he planned to dig, where he thought the house should sit to catch the southern light in winter. She asked questions that were practical and informed, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he valued her opinion on what she saw. They rode back toward Caldwell in the long gold light of late afternoon, and they were quieter now, the way you can be quiet with someone when the first effort of becoming acquainted has settled into something more natural. The horses walked easily. The prairie stretched in every direction. "I want to thank you," Lydia said, not looking at him, "for what you did this morning. I am aware that it created a legal complication for you, and I intend to have an attorney look at the arrangement to see how best to untangle it in a way that protects your claim." "I am not worried about the claim," John said. "You should be. It is your land." "The land will be what it is regardless of what a piece of paper says," he said. "What I am thinking about is what Pratt would have done if I had not been there, and the fact that he would have turned you away and you would have had no recourse." "I would have found recourse," Lydia said. "Eventually. I would have written to the county seat, to the territorial office. I would have found an attorney." "You would have," he agreed, "but it would have cost you months, maybe a full season." "Yes," she said, "it would have." She finally looked at him, and the afternoon light fell across her face at an angle that made his breath come a little shorter than it should have. "I am not accustomed to accepting help from strangers," she said. "It makes me uneasy. But I am trying to simply be grateful instead of suspicious, because I believe you were acting from genuine decency and not from anything else." "That is all it was," he said. "All right then," she said. "Thank you, John Barlow." He liked the way she said his name. He noticed this about himself and filed it away without examination. They reached Caldwell as the sun was touching the horizon and turning everything amber and rose. At the livery, they dismounted and handed their horses over to the boy who worked the evening shift, and they stood in the street for a moment in the particular sweetness of a day that has gone better than it began. "Will you be staying in town tonight?" Lydia asked. "At the hotel, yes. I have business at the hardware merchant tomorrow morning." "I am also at the hardware merchant tomorrow morning," she said, with a small expression that might almost have been amusement. "Perhaps we should simply coordinate. There is no reason to make two separate trips when one would serve." "No reason at all," John agreed. He watched her walk down the street toward the boarding house, her dark blue dress moving in the last of the evening wind, and he stood there longer than was strictly necessary before he turned and walked toward the hotel. Over the following 3 weeks, as the spring deepened into the bright, urgent green of Kansas May, Lydia Whitaker and John Barlow built a practical arrangement that neither of them would have described as anything more than practical, though both of them were aware, in the honest private quarters of their own minds, that it was becoming something else. They both needed supplies for their respective building projects, their respective homestead improvements, and they were heading the same direction from the same town, and there was simply no logical reason not to coordinate their efforts. This was what they told themselves, and it was not entirely untrue. They made 5 trips south from Caldwell together in those 3 weeks, hauling lumber and seed and wire fencing, and the heavy iron components of a stove that took both of them to maneuver from the wagon bed. Lydia was building a small house on the eastern edge of her section, a single-room structure for now, with the intention of adding to it as money permitted. She was doing most of the work herself, which John discovered the first time he rode out to find her on the roof, driving nails with a confidence that suggested she had done it before. He had stood beside the wagon for a moment looking up at her, this woman in her work dress with her hair pinned back and her face red from the sun, making a house from raw lumber with her own 2 hands, and something had shifted in his chest in a way he did not immediately know how to categorize. "Are you going to help or just observe?" she called down. "Help," he said, and climbed up. They worked together well, which was perhaps the most surprising thing about it. There was a naturalness to it, an ease of motion and purpose that you did not always find even between people who had known each other for years. John would anticipate what she needed before she asked, and she would see what he was about to do and adjust without discussion, and the work went faster and better for the combination than either of them would have achieved alone. In the evenings, when the light went too thin for work, they would sit on the unfinished boards of the new porch and eat whatever one of them had thought to bring, dried beef and cornbread, and sometimes a tin of peaches that was an almost extravagant luxury in that context. And they would talk until the stars came out over the open prairie like someone had spilled a jar of salt across black velvet. John brought her a book one evening, a battered copy of Great Expectations that he had been carrying in his saddlebag for 6 months. He gave it to her without ceremony, simply held it out and said he had finished it and thought she might enjoy it. She took it and turned it over in her hands and looked at it for a long moment before she looked at him. "Thank you," she said, and there was something in the 2 words that went beyond the book. She read it in 3 days, and when she gave it back to him on the next trip south, she had opinions about every character and was particularly fierce in her defense of Pip's essential goodness despite his flaws. And John sat on a barrel of nails in the unfinished room of her house and listened to her with his arms resting on his knees and a smile on his face that he was not wholly aware of. "You disagree," she said, catching his expression. "I do not disagree. I like that you are so certain about it." She looked at him. "You are laughing at me." "I am absolutely not laughing at you. I am enormously enjoying this conversation, which is not the same thing." She considered him for a moment, and the flush on her cheeks was not entirely from the afternoon heat. "It is not a quality that always endears me to people," she said, "being so certain." "It endears you to me," he said, and then looked slightly surprised at himself for saying it. The silence that followed was a different kind than they had been sharing, warmer, more aware of itself. Lydia looked down at her hands and then out the unfinished window frame where the afternoon prairie spread away in every direction, gold and green and infinite. "John," she said. "Yes. I want to ask you something, and I would like you to answer honestly, even if you think the answer will complicate things." "All right," she looked at him. "Are you beginning to feel something about this, about us spending time together?" He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "I believe I am." "So am I," she said. "And I'm not sure what to do about that because this is not a situation I have much experience with, and I have a great many practical concerns that take precedence, and I do not want to make a mistake that costs either of us something important." "Neither do I," he said. "So what do we do?" He thought about it. John Barlow was a man who had made his worst decisions in haste and his best ones in patience, and he knew which one this required. "We keep doing what we are doing," he said. "We build our houses and we work our land and we talk to each other honestly, and we let it be what it is going to be without forcing it to be anything before it is ready." Lydia looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once with the decisiveness of a woman who, when she agrees to something, means it entirely. "That seems right," she said. They went back to work. June arrived with heat and thunderstorms. The great rolling prairie storms that came up fast in the afternoons, purple-black clouds, stacking on the western horizon like a wall being built by something enormous. Lydia had learned to watch the sky by now with the instinctual wariness of someone who has spent enough time on the open land to know that the weather here was not a backdrop, but a participant. One afternoon in mid-June, she was working alone on her section when one of those storms came up faster than she had anticipated. She had seen the clouds building to the west for the better part of an hour but had made the calculation, common to people who have too much work to do and too little time, that she had enough time to finish the section of fencing she was working on before it hit. She was wrong. The storm swept in with a speed that was almost mean-spirited, and in the space of 20 minutes the sky went from ominous to black, and the wind came up hard enough to pull the pins from her hair, and the first sheet of rain arrived like something thrown rather than fallen. She made it to the small house, which had 4 walls and a roof now, and pulled the door shut against the wind and stood inside in the dark, while the storm moved over her land like a living thing. She sat on her cot in the dark and listened to the rain on the roof and the thunder rolling across the prairie like something looking for something. And she thought about her mother's farm in Missouri and how the storms there had a different voice than these. And she thought about the fencing she had not finished, and whether the creek would run high and threaten the low east corner of her section. And she thought about John Barlow. She thought about the way he had looked at her when she said she was beginning to feel something. That steady, honest, undefended look, with nothing behind it but truth. She pressed her hand flat against her chest, in the dark in the storm, and felt her own heartbeat and thought, well, so there it is. The storm passed in an hour. She went back outside to find 2 fence posts knocked down and her kitchen garden flattened, but the house solid and the creek, though running high, contained within its banks. She spent the rest of the afternoon putting the garden back to rights. She heard Pilgrim's hooves on the soft ground before she saw John coming up the track from the north, and she looked up from where she was kneeling in the garden with her hands full of muddy herb seedlings. He pulled up and looked at her and looked at the garden and then at the knocked-down fence posts and then back at her. "You all right?" he said. "I am fine. I was inside when it got bad." She sat back on her heels. "I did not expect to see you today." "I was in town and I saw the storm come in from your direction," he said. He said it simply, without elaboration, but she understood the thing underneath it, that he had been worried, that he had ridden out. She looked at him sitting on Pilgrim in the wet, golden light that came after the prairie storms, the light that made everything look washed and new, and she felt the feeling she had identified in the dark during the storm move through her with a certainty she had not felt about many things in her life. "Will you stay for supper?" she said. He stayed. She cooked what she had, which was beans and salt pork and the last of some onions, and they ate it at the small table she had made from 2 boards and a sawbuck, and the meal was better than its ingredients because of the company, and both of them knew this without saying it. After supper the evening was cool and clean from the rain, and they sat outside on the porch steps watching the last of the light go out of the sky in the west, leaving the stars to take over, and the silence between them was the particular kind that has something coiled inside it. John reached over in that silence and found her hand where it rested on the step between them. He did not take it exactly, just placed his hand over hers, his thumb resting at the edge of her palm. Lydia did not move. She looked down at their hands and then out at the dark prairie and took a breath. "John," she said softly. "Yes," he said, equally soft. "I have not let myself want things for a long time," she said. "It seemed safer not to. Wanting things that did not come through was too expensive." "I know that feeling," he said. "But I am wanting something now," she said, "and I am choosing to let myself want it, which is a very different and scarier thing than simply noticing you want something." He turned his hand and took hers properly, laced his fingers through hers with a care that was almost undoing. "What do you want?" he asked, and his voice was low and warm in the dark. She turned to look at him, and his face was close in the way faces are when you have been sitting beside someone in the dark and the space between you has gradually, imperceptibly been closing. "I want this," she said, "whatever this is becoming." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached up with his free hand and touched her cheek with his fingertips, just the lightest possible contact. The way you touch something you are trying to understand is real. "So do I," he said. When he kissed her, it was gentle and deliberate and completely without haste, the kiss of a man who has been thinking about something carefully and is certain of it now. She kissed him back with the full, decided commitment of a woman who does not do anything halfway. They pulled back from each other and sat together in the dark, hands still joined, and the prairie stretched away around them in the enormous quiet of a summer night in Kansas in 1880, and there was not a single thing about the moment that either of them would have changed. July was the fullness of summer and the fullness of something else. Lydia finished the interior of her house, sanded the floorboards, built a proper shelf along one wall for her books and her few china pieces that had come with her from Missouri wrapped in her mother's aprons. John worked his own section with a focused industry that was fueled in part by a vision he was beginning to have, a vision he had not yet put into words, but that was becoming more clear and more necessary every day. He rode over to Lydia's section most evenings after his own work was done, and they would sit on her porch in the cooling air and talk, or he would read to her from a novel he had picked up in town, or she would mend something while he cleaned the tack, and they would simply exist in the same space in the easy, unself-conscious way of people who have made a home of each other's company. He met her at the town market one Saturday in mid-July, and they walked the stalls together, and the vegetable seller and the dry goods merchant, and the woman who sold butter and cheese all seemed to understand, without being told anything, exactly what they were looking at, and there was a warmth in the way they were greeted as though the town, too, had been expecting something to resolve itself and was glad to see it doing so. There was a dance that Saturday evening, held in the barn of a man named Harris on the northern edge of town, a regular summer thing with a fiddle player from Wichita, and a caller who could make the most self-conscious man forget himself. Lydia had heard about it at the market and said, almost casually, that it sounded like an enjoyable evening. "It does," John agreed, equally casually, and they both understood that they would be going. He came to the boarding house to collect her at 7 o'clock, and when she came down the stairs in a dress he had not seen before, a soft gray-blue with small white flowers at the collar, her dark hair pinned up but with a few strands left loose around her face, he stood in the entry hall and very nearly forgot what he had come to say. "You look beautiful," he said, because there was no other word for it, and because John Barlow, whatever his other qualities, was not a man who withheld truth out of shyness. Lydia looked at him with those honest, complex eyes and said, "Thank you. You look very fine yourself." He had brushed his hat and his good jacket, and he offered her his arm as they went out into the warm Saturday evening, and she took it in a way that felt like something they had been doing for years. The dance was everything a barn dance in the summer of 1880 ought to be. Loud and warm, and full of the kind of collective joy that springs up when people who work very hard have a reason to stop working. The fiddle player was excellent, and the caller kept everyone on their feet, and the lanterns hung from the rafters sent long, swinging shadows across the dancers. John danced with Lydia and she surprised him. He had expected her to be good at it, and she was, but not at the way she laughed when she miscounted in the reel and was 2 beats behind. A full, unguarded laugh that he heard above the fiddle and the stomping feet, and that he was going to be hearing in his memory for a very long time. He held her hand tighter in the next set, and she caught his eye, and the laugh was still there in her expression. And for a moment the barn and the other dancers fell back, and there was only that, the warmth of her hand in his and the way she looked at him. They stepped outside for air between sets, and stood in the moonlit field beside the barn where the night was big and quiet except for the muffled fiddle from inside. "You are happy tonight," she said, looking up at him. "I am," he said. "I am too," she said simply. "It is a good thing to notice." He was quiet for a moment. He was working up to something, and she could see it in him, the way his expression settled into a different register of seriousness. "Lydia," he said. "Yes. I have been thinking about something for a while now, and I have been trying to find the right time and the right way to say it, and I have concluded that there may not be a right time and that I should simply say it." She turned to face him fully, and the moonlight fell across her features, and she was waiting with the particular stillness of someone who knows something important is coming. "I love you," he said. "I am aware that this is fast by most measures, and I am aware that you value your independence and your land and your life on your own terms, and I am not asking you to change any of that. But I love you, and I want you to know it, because it is the truest thing I know right now." Lydia stood very still. Then she stepped forward and put both her hands flat against his chest and looked up at him, and her eyes were bright in the moonlight with something that was not quite tears. "John Barlow," she said softly, "I have been telling myself for 2 months that I was being practical and sensible about what was happening between us, and I believe I was lying to myself, because the truth is that I have been in love with you since you stood beside me at that counter and said put her name on mine, and I did not have the courage to say so before now." He put his arms around her and held her, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, and the fiddle started up again inside, and the summer night went on around them, enormous and full of cricket song and starlight, and both of them were aware that something had been said out loud that made everything that came before it a prelude and everything that came after it a different kind of story. August in Kansas is not a kind month. The heat settles in and the grass bleaches and the sky goes white with it, and the work does not stop because the weather is hard. Lydia's kitchen garden needed constant watering from the creek, hauled in buckets because she had not yet been able to afford the pump she wanted, and the work was heavy and repetitive and unglamorous, and she did it every morning before the full heat of the day arrived. One morning in the first week of August, she was on her 3rd trip from the creek when she saw a man on horseback at her gate that she did not recognize. He was a wide man, heavy through the shoulders, on a horse that was too good for his general presentation, and he had the particular kind of smile that is not a welcome thing to encounter when you are alone on your section with no one in hearing distance. His name, she would learn, was Dale Prout, and he operated a land brokerage out of Caldwell that had a flexible relationship with legal boundaries. He had been watching the new homesteaders on the south sections with the professional interest of a man who knows which ones are likely to struggle and which ones might be persuaded. "Morning," he said from the gate. "You the woman holding this section?" "I am," Lydia said, setting down her buckets without breaking his gaze. "I have an offer for you," he said. "Buying up some of these homestead parcels for a client of mine. Not asking you to leave anything you are attached to, just making a business inquiry." "This section is not for sale," Lydia said. "Now, a young woman out here alone, I imagine there are days when the prospect of a cash payment and a train ticket somewhere more comfortable seems very reasonable." "If there were such days," Lydia said evenly, "this would not be one of them. Good morning, Mr. Prout, Dale Prout. You sure the offer is fair, better than fair?" "I am certain. This land is legally filed, jointly registered, and I have no interest in selling any portion of it." "Good morning, Mr. Prout." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she did not like, and then tipped his hat with a performance of pleasantness that did not reach his eyes, and turned his horse and rode back up the track. She told John about it that evening, matter-of-factly. Over the supper, they had fallen into the habit of sharing at her table most evenings. John's expression changed when she mentioned Prout's name. "I know that name," he said. "There was a land dispute outside Wichita 2 years back. A family of settlers, the Henrys, filed a claim and built for 8 months, and then they lost it on a technicality that most people thought had been manufactured. Prout's name was in the papers around the edges of it. So he is someone I should be wary of," Lydia said. "We should be wary of," John said. "He came to my section last week. I did not mention it because I did not want to worry you without cause. Now I think I should have." He was angry with himself about that, and she could see it. The way his jaw had set and his eyes had gone a shade darker, that inward-turned look of a man reviewing a decision and finding it wanting. "We have both had visits then," she said, "and we both told him no, and our filings are legal and properly recorded." "Yes." "Then the situation is what it is, and we deal with it if it becomes something that needs dealing with." "You are very calm about this," he said. "I have found that panic is less useful than attention," she said. "I will be paying close attention." So would John. He made a quiet trip to the county seat at Wellington the following week, and had a long conversation with a clerk he knew, and came back satisfied that their filings were airtight and registered correctly, and that any attempt to challenge them on a technicality would fail. He also stopped in to see the county sheriff on his way back through Caldwell, a man named Willis who had the look of someone who had been doing this job long enough to have seen most varieties of trouble, and was not easily surprised by new ones. He mentioned Prout. Sheriff Willis listened and wrote something down, and said that Prout had not done anything illegal as far as he knew, but that he had been noting the man's activities in the area with interest. "The law is slow sometimes," Willis said. "But it gets there. That is what I am counting on," John said. Prout came back to Lydia's section twice more in August, both times with his offer freshened by a higher number, and both times Lydia told him with increasing directness that the land was not for sale, and she would appreciate it if he ceased visiting. The second time, she told him she had spoken to the sheriff, which was true, and that any further attempts to pressure her would be documented and reported. Prout left without further comment, and she did not see him again that month. She told John about each visit. He listened each time with the focused attention of a man cataloging information, and she could see the effort it cost him to let her handle it in her own way rather than ride over and handle it himself, and she appreciated both the restraint and the cost of it. "He will not come back," she told him after the second visit. "Men like that want easy targets. I am not an easy target." "No," John said, with a warmth in his voice that had several meanings. "You are absolutely not." Prout did not come back. He moved on, as men like that do, to sections with more uncertain owners, and there was a brief, unpleasant legal matter in September involving a homesteader west of town who had signed something he should not have signed, but that was not Lydia's or John's concern. September came and the land took on the burnished, quiet beauty of early autumn, the grasses going gold and bronze, the creek running clear and cold. Lydia's kitchen garden had done well, better than she had expected, and she had put up a good deal of produce in jars that lined one wall of her house like a row of small suns. John's house was done, a solid 2-room structure on his section, better built than he had intended because the building had taken on additional meaning somewhere along the way. He had put in a proper chimney and a wood floor, and windows that faced west to catch the afternoon light, and he had built a porch that was 3 steps broader than strictly necessary. One evening in late September, he took Lydia to see it, the first time she had visited his finished house, and she walked through the rooms with the same quiet attention she gave to everything, running her hand along the window frame, testing the solidity of the shelves. She stopped in the larger room and stood in the last of the afternoon light that came through the west window and looked around at what he had built. "It is a good house," she said softly. "I kept thinking," he said from the doorway behind her, "about what it would need to feel like a home rather than a shelter." She turned to look at him, and the light was in her face, warm and gold. "What did you decide?" she asked. He had been thinking for weeks about how to say this, and in the end he said it the only way he knew, directly and without performance. "I decided it needed a life in it," he said, "not just mine. I kept thinking of a life we might build together, you and I, if that is something you want." Lydia was very still. "John," she said slowly, "I am not asking you to give up your land. Your section stays yours. I am not asking you to give up anything you have worked for or become. I am asking if you would consider building a life with me, here on this land in this territory, together." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me, Lydia." The autumn light went long and amber through the window, and the prairie was quiet outside, and Lydia Whitaker stood in the middle of John Barlow's good house, and looked at the man she had been falling in love with since the morning he stood beside her at a counter in a dusty land office, and refused to let injustice stand unopposed. She had thought once, not so long ago, that love was a thing she could not afford, a luxury that required a stability she did not possess. She had thought that wanting something as large as a life shared with someone was a risk she could not absorb. She had organized her days around sufficiency and independence and the fierce, lean satisfaction of needing no one. Standing here now, she understood that she had been wrong, not about the independence which she would never give up, but about the needing. That needing something was not the same as weakness. That choosing someone was not the same as surrender. "Yes," she said. "John, yes." He crossed the room and took her face in his hands with that careful, wondering tenderness that was uniquely his, and kissed her in the afternoon light of the house they were about to make a home. They were married in October, in the small church in Caldwell, on a clear, cold morning when the sky was the particular deep blue that Kansas saves for its best days. The congregation was not large. A few friends from town, the woman from the diner who had given them coffee on the first morning and had appointed herself invested in their story ever since, the hardware merchant and his wife, Sheriff Willis, and a young woman named Clara who boarded at the same house Lydia had, who had become the closest thing to a confidant that Lydia had in town. John's parents had been written to, and his mother had sent a letter back so warm and so eager that Lydia had read it 3 times and felt, for the first time in years, the particular ache of what a mother feels like when you have been without one for a long time. His parents could not make the journey from Texas in time, but his mother's letter promised a visit in the spring, and the promise was made with such certainty that Lydia found herself already looking forward to it. The ceremony was simple and direct, the kind of ceremony that people who are serious about each other prefer over performance. The minister was a quiet man named Aldrich who had been in Caldwell for 6 years and had seen enough hard country to conduct a wedding with genuine feeling rather than formula. When he said the part about the ring, John took Lydia's left hand in his and slid a simple gold band onto her finger, and his hands were steady though hers were not quite, and he caught the slight tremor and held her hand in both of his until it stilled, and looked at her with an expression that communicated very clearly that everything was exactly as it should be. "You may kiss the bride," Minister Aldrich said, with a warmth that suggested he meant it as permission rather than instruction, and John kissed her with a gentle thoroughness that made the woman from the diner, whose name was Harriet and who had an opinion about most things, press her handkerchief briefly to her eyes. They had a small celebration at the diner after, with food that Harriet had been preparing for 3 days and refused to let anyone help with. And there was a sweetness to the afternoon that none of them would forget, the kind of sweetness that belongs to small celebrations held by people who have earned the thing they are celebrating. In the evening, they rode south together through the autumn prairie and came to John's house, which was now theirs, and Lydia carried over the last of her books and her china pieces from her own section's house the following day, though her house remained, and her land remained hers, and that was as it should be. The first winter of their marriage was hard the way that first winters in Kansas were hard, which is to say harder than you expect no matter how hard you expect it. The cold came in November like it meant business, and the snow that followed was not the gentle snow of more temperate places, but the full, uncompromising commitment of a prairie winter, blown horizontal by winds that had come 1,000 miles without interruption, and arrived at your door still traveling at full speed. John and Lydia had prepared as well as they could. They had a full wood supply, split and stacked under the lean-to John had built against the south wall of the house. They had their root cellar stocked with the harvest from Lydia's kitchen garden and from the market in town. They had 2 good horses, a milk cow that John had traded for in late October, a small flock of chickens that were dramatically unimpressed by the winter conditions and expressed this through reduced egg production, and 2 cats of unknown parentage who had arrived at the property in September and stayed because the situation suited them. The long winter evenings were their own kind of gift. Lydia read and sewed and wrote letters to the relatives of her younger siblings, to John's mother in Texas, to Clara at the boarding house, keeping the threads of connection alive across the cold distances. John worked at the table on accounts and plans, or repaired tack and harness that the summer had roughened, or simply sat across from her by the fire and read. And there was a contentment in those evenings that he had not known before, and that he had the sense to recognize as something rare. They talked in those evenings with the freedom that darkness and warmth and closeness provide, telling each other the things there had not been occasion to tell yet, stories from childhood, fears that did not come out easily in daylight, small, precise memories that turned out to matter. John told her about his grandfather, who had given him the bone-handled knife, and who had been the first person to suggest that how a man treated people with less power than himself was the truest measure of his character. Lydia told him about her mother, not just the loss of her but the life of her, a woman who had kept a household and a farm going with a cheerful implacability that Lydia had understood only in retrospect was a form of extraordinary courage. In December, a week before Christmas, Lydia told him something else. They had been sitting by the fire in the evening, and she had been quieter than usual for several days, not troubled exactly but interior in a way he had learned to respect and wait on. She put her sewing down and looked at him across the hearth. "John," she said. "Yes," he said, folding his paper and giving her his full attention. "I believe I am with child," she said. The fire popped and settled. John looked at her, and the expression that crossed his face was not a simple thing. It was layered, wonder and fear, and a joy so big it looked almost like pain for a moment before it sorted itself out into something clear and unmistakable. He got up from his chair and came to her and knelt in front of her and took her hands. "Are you certain?" he asked softly. "Reasonably so," she said. "I will need to see the doctor in town to be sure, but I am reasonably certain." He looked at her hands in his and then up at her face, and what was in his face was such an uncomplicated, open happiness that her eyes went bright. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Uncertain," she said honestly, "and glad both at once." "That sounds right," he said. He stayed kneeling, holding her hands, and the fire went on, and the winter wind moved outside, and neither of them said anything for a while, because some things settle better in silence than in words. The doctor in Caldwell confirmed it in early January. Dr. Fielding was a small man with an impressive mustache and a manner that managed to be both brisk and kind, and he gave Lydia a list of practical instructions and the prognosis that everything appeared healthy and normal, and that she should expect her confinement sometime in late July or early August. John was waiting outside the doctor's office when she came out. He was sitting on the bench by the door with his hat in his hands and an expression of barely contained concern that he was trying very hard to make look like casual patience. She stopped in front of him and smiled. "Late July, early August," she said. "The doctor says everything is perfectly in order." He stood up, and the relief that went through him was visible in every line of his body, and he put his arms around her right there on the boardwalk in front of the doctor's office in Caldwell, Kansas, in January of 1881, and held her carefully, as though she had become something even more precious than she had been before, which was already very much. "Stop that," she said against his shoulder, though she did not move. "I am not fragile." "I know you are not," he said. "Then stop holding me like I am." "Give me just a moment," he said, and she laughed and let him have it. John's parents arrived from Texas in May, as promised, making the long trip by train to Caldwell, and then the wagon ride south to the section. And Lydia was so prepared for nerves that the actual meeting took her somewhat by surprise. Ellen Barlow was 61, a small, dark-eyed woman who had the same quality of quiet intensity as her son, the sense that she was always truly present, never elsewhere. She stepped down from the wagon and looked at Lydia with eyes that took in everything at once, and then she opened her arms and said, "Come here, child," in the particular tone that admits of no argument. Lydia, who had not been held by a mother in 5 years, walked into those arms and felt something she had not expected, a kind of relief so deep it was structural, like a beam finding its footing. Samuel Barlow was taller than his son by an inch and broader, and had the weathered, specific beauty of a man who had spent his life outdoors and wore it honestly. He shook Lydia's hand with both of his and said, with the directness that appeared to be a family trait, "John tells us you are one of the finest people he has ever met. I can see he was understating the case." "He is very kind to say so," Lydia managed. "He is not kind, particularly," Samuel said. "He is accurate." "There is a difference." The Barlows stayed for 2 weeks, and in those 2 weeks they dug fence posts and helped paint the barn that John had been building, and Ellen taught Lydia 3 recipes from her mother's kitchen in San Antonio that Lydia wrote down in her careful handwriting and kept afterward like small treasures. Samuel and John worked from sunrise to late afternoon and argued companionably about the best approach to every task, and reached the same conclusions they would have reached if they had simply agreed from the beginning, which was how they had apparently always operated. In the evenings they sat together on the broad porch that John had built, and the prairie spring spread out around them in its full generous bloom, and Ellen asked Lydia questions about her life, with the genuine curiosity of a woman who understood that every life contains things worth knowing. She asked about Lydia's mother, and listened to the answer without the polite half-attention that grief stories sometimes received, but with full, real attention, and said afterward, "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "I believe you carry her with you, whether you know it or not," Lydia said. "I hope so," and meant it more than she had meant very much. When the Barlows left to return to Texas, there were promises of letters and another visit the following year, and Ellen held Lydia again at the wagon and said quietly, for only her to hear, "That boy of mine has been looking for something worth being rooted to for a long time. You are it. Take care of each other." "We will," Lydia said. She stood in the yard and watched the wagon go up the track toward Caldwell and felt John come and stand beside her, and she took his hand without looking at him. "I understand you better now," she said. "Is that good?" "It is very good," she said. "You come from good people." He pressed her hand. "So do you," he said. "Even if you had to find most of them on your own." July came in hot and full, and Lydia worked her garden in the mornings and rested in the afternoons, and felt the baby move with an authority that suggested to her a very decided character. John had hired a young hand from town, a 17-year-old named Tommy Alcott, who was eager and willing, and had the gift of being useful without being underfoot, and Tommy handled the heavier work on both sections through the summer with good cheer and not too many questions. Dr. Fielding made 2 visits out to the section in July to check on Lydia, arriving in his small buggy with his bag and his impressive mustache and his calm, practical manner, and pronounced her in excellent health and the baby in the correct position, and everything proceeding as it ought. John, in those weeks, was a study in the particular tension of a man who wants very badly to be helpful and is also trying not to communicate his anxiety to the person he wants to help. Lydia saw through this immediately, because she saw through most things he tried to conceal, and she told him with direct kindness that she was not afraid, and that he did not need to pretend he was not, and that being honest with each other about what they were feeling was something they had agreed to from the beginning, and she did not want to stop now. He told her then that he was frightened in the way that men were frightened when the people they loved were in something they could not enter or help with, that there was a powerlessness to it that sat in his chest like a stone. She took his hand and put it over the place where the baby was moving, and he felt it under his palm, that unmistakable life in motion, and the stone did not go away entirely, but became something he could carry without it crushing him. Their son was born on the 1st of August, 1881, in the bedroom of the house John had built, with Dr. Fielding in attendance and Harriet from the diner, who had appointed herself a fixture in their lives, keeping the fire and the hot water and the general situation in hand with her usual firm competence. Lydia labored through the long August day, and John sat outside the bedroom door in the hallway because Dr. Fielding had politely but firmly relocated him from the room, and he sat with his hands between his knees and listened to the sounds from behind the door with a focused, helpless attention that was among the harder things he had done in his life. When the baby's cry came, clear and astonished and indignant in the way of new things that have arrived unexpectedly into a louder and more complex world than they anticipated, John rose to his feet and stood very still. Harriet opened the bedroom door a moment later. Her face was red from the heat and her eyes were bright, and she said, "Come in, John Barlow. Come and see what you have." He went in. Lydia was propped against the pillows, exhausted in the profound, luminous way of women who have just done the hardest thing there is to do, and in her arms was a small, red, furious-faced boy who had apparently already decided he had opinions about the situation and would be communicating them thoroughly. John sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and then at his wife, and the feeling that moved through him was one that did not have a word large enough for it. It was love and gratitude and fear and wonder, and something that was simply the awareness of being alive at the exact right moment. And it was, he would tell you later if you asked, the moment that he understood what his grandfather had been trying to tell him all along about what a man was for. "He is remarkable," John said. "He is very loud," Lydia said and smiled. "What shall we name him?" They had discussed names in the general, theoretical way of people who are being careful not to want something too specifically before they have it, and no final decision had been reached. Lydia looked down at the boy in her arms, at the small set of his jaw and the dark hair that was already, improbably, abundant. "Samuel," she said. "For your father." John looked at her. "Samuel James Barlow," she said. "James was my father's name." He could not speak for a moment. He took her hand instead and pressed it to his mouth, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and Samuel James Barlow went on announcing his arrival to the world with full vocal commitment. The seasons turned, the way they do on the prairie, with an indifferent, beautiful regularity that teaches you both the smallness and the importance of your own story within the larger one. Samuel grew from an infant who had opinions into a toddler who had opinions and furthermore could express them ambulatorially, which introduced a new category of concern to the household. He had John's eyes and Lydia's determination, and a laugh that came from both of them equally and belonged entirely to himself. Lydia's section, which she had kept and managed through everything, was now under cultivation in a way that had grown past the kitchen garden into a proper small farm. She had planted winter wheat in the fall and watched it come up in the spring, with the particular satisfaction of a person who has coaxed something from the earth that was not there before. John's section was cattle country, small by the standards of the Texas ranches but steady and well managed, and together the two parcels made a holding that was beginning to attract the respectful attention of neighbors who had seen enough borderline operations to know a properly run place when they saw one. They had neighbors now, a dozen families within riding distance, some of whom they saw regularly, and some of whom they saw only at the occasional town gathering. The Hendersons, 2 miles east, were Lydia's particular friends, a family from Ohio with 3 children and a practical, cheerful wife named Martha who came over once a week, and whose visits Lydia looked forward to with a genuine pleasure that she recognized as the pleasure of true friendship. John and the Henderson husband, William, had reached the kind of male friendship that consists largely of working alongside each other without speaking very much and finding this deeply satisfactory. The land office and Gerald Pratt behind his counter was a story that circulated in the southern sections because Lydia had told Martha, who had the narrative instincts of someone who understood that certain stories need to be told and remembered. It became, over time, a small but specific piece of local history. The woman who had been turned away at the land office, and the cowboy who had said put her name on mine, and how those two things had become a marriage and a farm and a life. Pratt himself left Caldwell in the spring of 1882, transferred to another posting. Lydia heard about it from Clara, who was still in town, and felt the particular satisfaction of an injustice that had not broken the person it was aimed at, which is the best and most sustainable form of justice. The legal arrangement on the jointly filed claim had been sorted out properly in the first year of their marriage, by an attorney in Wellington who had found the whole situation both interesting and appropriately resolvable. Lydia's section was in her name, cleanly and unambiguously, and John's section was in his, and the attorney had been impressed by the clarity with which both of them understood their legal rights and had said so, which Lydia had received with a dignity that John found extremely entertaining. In the autumn of 1882, when Samuel was 14 months old and just beginning to navigate the world on 2 legs with the focused, concentrated effort of a very small person determined to master an engineering problem, Lydia began to suspect she was with child again. She was right. She told John on an October evening on the porch, in the cooling air that smelled of turning leaves and coming frost, with Samuel asleep inside, and the stars coming out over the prairie in their customary abundance. John turned to look at her with the same layered expression as before, wonder and joy and the specific fear of a man who loves something enough to be afraid for it. And she took his hand and held it, and he gathered himself quickly this time, less afraid because of having been through it once and found her on the other side. "When?" he asked. "May, I think. The doctor will tell us for certain." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture that was entirely his own, a private signature he made on things that mattered most to him. "Are you glad?" she asked. "Lydia," he said, with the gentle exasperation of someone who is being asked a question with an obvious answer, "I am so glad I do not have the words for it." She leaned into his shoulder. "Good. So am I." Their daughter arrived in May of 1883, in the same bedroom with the same doctor, with a spring thunderstorm rolling across the prairie outside that Lydia, in the private theater of a laboring woman, found either appropriate or excessive, and could not decide which. She came in the early evening when the storm had passed, and the air was clean, and the western sky was doing something extraordinary with the light, and she announced her arrival with considerably more vocal sophistication than her brother had, which Dr. Fielding noted with professional interest. She was small and dark-haired and had Lydia's features arranged in a face that would clearly, eventually, be her mother's exactly, and John held her in the first minutes after she arrived and stood by the window in the pale evening light and was simply quiet for a long time. "Rachel," Lydia said from the bed, watching him. "I want to call her Rachel Ellen." He looked up. Ellen was his mother's name. He could not speak, the second time in his life in this room that had happened. He nodded instead, just once, and looked back down at his daughter. Rachel Ellen Barlow was born into a world that was, for all its hardnesses, a good one, shaped by parents who had chosen it deliberately and built it honestly, and who understood that the foundation of anything lasting was the truth told between two people who trust each other enough to tell it. The years moved in the way of prairie years, full and sometimes hard and always, in aggregate, more beautiful than otherwise. Samuel grew into a boy who had his mother's love of books and his father's love of the land, and could be found in the evenings equally likely to be reading on the porch or riding the section with John on a horse that was almost too big for him, learning the names of grasses and the behavior of cattle, and the way the light changed over the creek in the last hour before dark. Rachel grew into a girl who had inherited both her mother's quiet determination and her father's deep patience, which was an unusual combination in anyone, and made her, at 4, and then 5 and then 6, a person of formidable self-possession who kept her own counsel. And then, when she had decided on something, acted with a completeness that did not leave room for revision. Lydia's wheat fields expanded, season by season, and the farm diversified into a small operation that was respected enough that other settlers came to ask her advice about crops and soil and the management of the creek land. And she gave her advice freely and accurately, and with the directness that had always been her signature. She had learned in those years that there was a kind of power in having been first, in having stood her ground when the ground was uncertain, and that it carried an obligation to make the way a little easier for those who came after. She wrote, in the spring of 1884, to the county seat in Wellington, a formal letter of complaint regarding the practices of land offices that denied legal filers on the basis of gender. She sent copies to the territorial governor's office and to a newspaper in Wichita whose editor she had been corresponding with on several matters. She signed it with her full name and her property address and her filing date. She was one of several women who did similar things in those years, quiet insistences that the law be what it said it was, and the cumulative effect of those insistences was slow and partial but not nothing. John read the letter before she sent it because she showed him everything she wrote and he showed her everything he wrote, which was their habit and their agreement. "This is a good letter," he said, handing it back. "Is there anything that should be changed?" "Not a word," he said. She folded it and addressed it and handed it to Tommy Alcott, who was still with them at 20, now drawing a proper wage and boarding in the small structure they had built at the north end of the property for exactly that purpose, with a request to post it in Caldwell when he made the supply run the following morning. On a warm evening in the June of 1884, almost exactly 4 years after the morning at the land office that had started everything, John and Lydia sat on the porch as the sun went down over the western prairie, and the section was quiet around them with the specific quiet of a working place at the end of a working day. Samuel was inside, reading. Rachel was asleep. The cattle were in the south pasture. The wheat in Lydia's field was up and full and rippling in the evening wind. John had a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and he was looking west at the sunset, and Lydia was in the chair beside him with her legs folded up and her own coffee, and a book that she was not at the moment reading. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, the way you can ask someone this after 4 years and expect a real answer. "I was thinking about the morning at the land office," he said. She looked at him. "That is a coincidence. I was just thinking about it as well." "Were you?" "I was thinking about what would have happened if you had not been there," she said. "Not that I would not have found a way eventually, but I was thinking about the specific shape that everything would have taken without that morning." John looked out at his land, at the grass and the creek and the sky going rose and gold in the west, and thought about what was inside the house behind him and what was growing in the field to the east and what was sitting in the chair beside him, this woman who had become the axis of his life, around whom every other true thing organized itself. "I think about it differently," he said. "How do you think about it?" "I think about it as the morning I found out who I was going to spend my life with," he said. "I think Gerald Pratt may be the most inadvertent matchmaker in the history of Kansas." She laughed, a real, full laugh, the one he loved best because it was the one that came without planning, and he turned to look at her in the evening light. This woman he had signed his name beside on a piece of government paper because something in him had known, immediately and without argument, that it was the right thing to do. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had on the porch step 4 years ago, but different now, the difference between a first touch and a thousandth, between discovery and homecoming. "I would do it again," he said, "every morning for the rest of my life." Lydia looked at him with those honest, complex, beautiful eyes, and the evening light was in her face, and the prairie was all around them, and the life they had built was real and solid in theirs. "So would I," she said, "every single morning." They sat together as the sun finished its work and the stars began to show, and the great prairie dark came down around their house and their land and their children and their life, and it was full and it was good and it was, in all the ways that matter, exactly as it should be. In the years that followed, the Barlow homestead became one of the established places in the southern sections of Sumner County, the kind of place that newer settlers navigated by and oriented toward when they were finding their bearings. Lydia expanded her fields and John expanded his herd, and they built a proper barn with a loft and proper stabling, and then a second room onto the house for the children, and then a covered back porch that became Lydia's favorite place in all seasons, where she kept her herb garden in pots along the railing, and where the view south was the longest and most open. Samuel at 7 was reading 2 grades above his year, and driving his mother, with great love, slightly toward distraction with the volume and variety of his questions. Rachel at 4 had discovered that horses were the most interesting thing in the world, and had appointed herself John's assistant in all equine matters, which John encouraged with an encouragement that Lydia privately found completely transparent and entirely endearing. Tommy Alcott had by 1885 saved enough of his wages to file his own homestead claim on a section 3 miles east, and John and Lydia helped him build his first structure the same way they had helped each other in the beginning, with labor and advice, and the particular solidarity of people who have been through the thing and know what it requires. Tommy was 22 and still in possession of the good cheer he had brought to the job at 17, and Lydia thought that the land suited him in exactly the way it had suited her, as though he had been looking for it without knowing what he was looking for. John's parents came back for a second visit in the summer of 1885. And this time the visit was 3 weeks, and Samuel and his grandfather discovered each other with the particular joy of 2 people who have the same relationship to the world, and are meeting a version of it from a different generation. Samuel followed Samuel Barlow everywhere, asking questions about Texas and cattle and history, and the elder Samuel answered with a thoroughness that suggested he had been waiting for someone to ask. Ellen Barlow sat with Lydia on the covered back porch in the evenings, and they talked in the way of women who have found, late in life and unexpectedly, the kind of friend that understands everything without needing it spelled out. Ellen brought seeds from her garden in Texas, varieties she had been growing for 40 years, and she and Lydia planted them in the back porch garden together, and every year afterward when those plants came up, Lydia thought of that afternoon and felt the warmth of it. The morning at the land office in Caldwell had been, Lydia reflected on a quiet October evening in 1885, as she sat at her desk and wrote in the journal she had been keeping since the first days on the homestead, the first morning of a life she had not known she was about to begin living. She had walked in that morning with $47 in her hem, and a determination that she thought was purely her own, and she had walked out with a legal filing and the first thread of something that had become, over 5 years, the entire fabric of everything. She wrote in the journal with her careful handwriting, and the lamp threw its warm circle over the page, and John was across the room at the table doing accounts, and Samuel was asleep, and Rachel was asleep, and the autumn wind moved in the grass outside, and she wrote, because she wanted to remember it precisely. The morning I walked into the land office, I thought I was going to file a claim. I did not know that the man behind me in line would become the man I spend my life with. I did not know that an act of simple justice, of one person refusing to let a wrong stand, would be the first moment of the most important story I have ever been part of. I did not know that being turned away would be what led me, by the most indirect and extraordinary route, to exactly where I was meant to be. She closed the journal and set it on the shelf with the others. John looked up from the accounts. "You have that expression," he said. "What expression?" "The one where you have been thinking something important and are deciding whether to say it." She looked at him across the lamplit room, this man she loved with the complete, grounded certainty of someone who has had enough time to know the difference between love and its counterfeits. "I was thinking," she said, "that I am grateful for all of it, even the hard parts. Maybe especially the hard parts." He set down his pen. All of it," she said. "Even Gerald Pratt." He smiled at that, the quiet, real smile she loved. "Even Gerald Pratt," he agreed. She got up from her desk and went to him, and he turned in his chair to receive her, and she sat on the arm of it with her arm around his shoulders and his arm around her waist, and they stayed like that for a while in the lamp light, in the house they had built, on the land they had claimed, in the life they had chosen together. Outside, the Kansas prairie went on in the dark, enormous and patient and indifferent to the small, bright lights of human lives except insofar as it carried them, the way it carried everything, with the ancient, impersonal generosity of good ground. But inside the light was warm, and the children were sleeping, and the years ahead were full of things not yet known, of harvests and winters and ordinary Tuesdays and extraordinary mornings, of Samuel growing into a young man who would study law in Topeka and come home with a wife of his own one warm summer, of Rachel growing into a woman who would raise horses on the Barlow section with a skill that drew buyers from 3 counties, of John and Lydia growing old together with the particular grace of people who have spent decades in honest company and have been, in all the ways that truly matter, genuinely lucky. The story of how it began was told and retold in those years, at dinners and on porches, and in the letters that Lydia wrote to other women in other territories who were trying to make their own way on their own land. She told it plainly, the way she told everything, without embellishment, but without leaving out what mattered. She had gone to the land office in the spring of 1880. She had been turned away by a man who thought the law was something he could reinterpret to suit his own comfort. And the cowboy behind her in line had stepped forward and said, "Put her name on mine." That was the beginning. Everything else was what they built from it.